American English, American English, American English, webinar series. Teach and learn. American English, webinar series.
Welcome to the American English webinar series, brought to you by the American English team at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C. My name is Curtis, part of the American English team, also known as Moderator Curtis. You'll also see my friends, Moderator Amy and Moderator Katie. They will be in the chat box to help you during the webinar. We've had a few changes since our last webinar series. This webinar program is now called the American English Webinar Series. It used to be called Shaping the Way We Teach English webinar course, but don't worry, you can still expect the same great sessions, or maybe even better. Now, our webinars will be just 60 minutes long. In previous courses, they were 90. What's most exciting about our new American English webinar series is that each month the webinars will be related to a specific theme that you can also find on the American English website in the Teacher's Corner. In addition to the webinar, you'll find resources, lesson plans, and much more related to the topic. Here you can see the schedule for this series. After today, our next webinar is on Wednesday, October 7th, entitled Co-Teaching Strategies for Sharing and Improving the Teaching Experience. Can everybody still hear me? There seem to be some technical difficulties. Okay, everybody can still hear me, great. So during these webinars, you will hear but not see the presenter. The way for you to participate is by using the chat box, as you are already doing. This is where you can ask questions or make comments related to today's topic. We may not be able to answer every question during the session, as there are often hundreds of teachers participating. However, there is another place to ask questions after the session is over. Your presenter may also ask you questions in the form of polls. These multiple choice questions will appear on the screen for you to answer. Some people may experience technical problems. Unfortunately, we cannot fix individual technical issues, but we will let you know if we are having a global issue. If you do lose sound, a great way to follow along is with the caption pod. Each webinar series consists of 6 webinars. During the series, webinars take place every other Wednesday. Participants who attend at least 4 out of 6 webinars receive an e-certificate from the Regional English Language Officer or local U.S. Embassy. To ensure you are eligible for the e-certificate, we will ask you to submit your attendance at the very end of the webinar. Please do not submit it before we request it, or it won't be counted. At the end of the webinar, you will click on this link and fill out the requested information. We hope many of you are already familiar with our Ning site, but if you haven't registered yet, please do join this site. Here you can find resources and discussion questions related to each webinar, as well as all of the webinar recordings. This is also where you can ask presenter questions after the webinar. If you visited the site before, you may notice it looks a little bit different. But don't worry, all the content is still there. The site just has a new name and a new look. Did you know that one of our webinars in this series will be featuring materials that you, our webinar audience members, create? Great materials that you have created may be featured for everyone in our webinar community to learn from and enjoy. You may have received an email through the Ning about a call for materials for the webinar Learn It, Share It, that will be presented by Ryan Brooks on October 21st. During this webinar, materials and ideas that you have created may be featured. If you would like to be featured in the webinar on October 21st, please read the instructions and the example submission on the call for materials pages shown here on the Ning. You must submit your materials by October 5th to be considered for a possible featured spot in Ryan's webinar on October 21st. We hope to see lots of your materials. And now for today's webinar. The session is Podcasting for the Classroom. Providing students enough speaking and listening time can be challenging in the class. However, by using freely available software, teachers can provide students opportunities for more speaking and listening via podcasting. Podcasts are music or discussion programs presented and delivered in a digital format. In this webinar, the presenter will explain where to find podcasts for classroom use, the software needed for students to make their own podcasts, and activities for the classroom to get students podcasting. Our presenter today is Jeff Kuhn. Jeff is a PhD candidate at Ohio University and an instructor in the departments of both linguistics and English. Jeff taught EFL in Japan, served in the Peace Corps in Mongolia as a teacher trainer before receiving his MA in linguistics. Recently, he worked as a consultant on the U.S. Department of State's Trace Effects, a video game for English language learners around the world. Jeff has presented on the use of games in the classroom at eTech Ohio, TESOL, and Calico, the Computer Assisted Language Instruction Consortium. His research interests include computer-assisted language learning, games and learning, and second language writing. Jeff, thank you for presenting this, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Curtis. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar in this series of the American English webinars. So this is Podcasting for the Classroom. I'm Jeff. I'm really excited to have everyone joining today for the webinar. There's over 250 of us from around the world. And I want to specifically say I saw Tansulu over in Kyrgyzstan. It's almost midnight over there, and he's still tuning in. So that's great to see. So thanks for those of you who are staying up late. And it's good to be doing this webinar. And before we get going, I would like to talk about those poll results. So as everyone was hanging out in the chat before the presentation, we had a poll. And it looks like, as far as resources, actually over 80% of us use YouTube as a resource. And, it's a great resource to have as a teacher, but what if we want to switch from using other people's content to creating our own content? One of the best ways to do that is through podcasting. So we're going to take a look at what podcasting can do in the classroom in a way to kind of kickstart student creativity. And to do that, we have to think about what is it that our students like to do. So your other poll result was, it looks like for most of us, sports and music are by far what our students love to talk about the most. And so how do we get that into the classroom and give them a chance to talk about what they love? And so let's get going here, because with podcasts, we get to bring students' interest into the classroom. That's one of the reasons I love teaching English, is that we have students who are gaining confidence and ability in the language. They get to talk more about themselves, more about their interests. And so we're lucky as teachers to kind of get this continually evolving relationship with our students, because as they grow in confidence and ability, they're able to bring more into the classroom. And so my goal, I believe, as a teacher, is to work these interests into the classroom so that students have a chance to discuss what they enjoy. And one way I do this is with podcasts. So let's kick off our webinar and talk about what our goals are for today. And so our goals really are to discover podcasts. What are they? Where to find them? We also want to talk about creating podcasts. So what are some free, flexible ways to create podcasts? And we're going to focus on one specifically called Audacity. And then finally, let's talk about making the best podcast we can. So how do we have our best practices in place for both students and teachers to make awesome podcasts? So very quickly, let's talk about what is a podcast. What does even that word mean? And so podcast is really just kind of a short for pod, small unit, and broadcast, like a radio broadcast. And so just out of curiosity, just a quick poll. Have you ever listened to a podcast? And have you ever used a podcast in your classroom? Wow, so we have 68% have listened to a podcast. And it looks like over half, almost 60% of us have never used a podcast in the classroom. So it's great that we're listening to these podcasts. We're aware of how they operate, that they exist is great. So how do we bring them into the classroom will be our big goal for today. So if we have, podcasts are short for pod and a broadcast, well, what does that mean? Well, really, they're just similar to radio shows that we might hear, but they're developed and released individually. And this allows them to be recorded and distributed and then stored online. And so now that we have this kind of loose definition of a podcast, let's take a quick listen to an actual podcast. So this is an example from Voice of America. It's their African News Tonight podcast. So let's take a listen.
Good evening and welcome to Nightline Africa. We are coming to you live from the English service of the Voice of America. Thanks for joining us. I'm Peter Flotte in Washington.
It's important to us because it is basically organized to mobilize the world in the level of heads of the state and government to support the implementation of the peace agreement.
UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon invites South Sudan's rebel leader to a special summit on the sidelines of the upcoming UN General Assembly.
Socio-economic situation is getting worse in Chad here, and salaries are not properly paid on time.
So that gives us a little bit of an example of what a podcast is. And it's very similar to radio. It really is coming out of a roots in radio broadcast. And you can see there was that little introduction, as a few of you mentioned, this great little melody, and then the topic. Now, Kiro asked, this is not school related, and no, it's not. Many podcasts are just designed to be listened to. Now, they can be educational, but they can also be entertaining, informative, and so they're not necessarily language or education based, but they can be. And we'll take a look at some later in the webinar that are a little more educational focused. Now, what's also great about podcasts is that many of them are offered under Creative Commons license. And under a Creative Commons license, material can be used and modified without needing the express permission of the author. So that means that as teachers, we can edit and change many podcasts for classroom use. And as a few of you mentioned, many of these podcasts are free, so we can download them and use them absolutely free of charge, distribute them to our students, even edit and change them a little bit for listening activities or in-class activities of various sorts. There's a lot of great resources for teachers available under this Creative Commons licensing. So if you're interested in learning more about those, definitely check out this month's Teachers Corner over at the AmericanEnglish.state.gov website, where you can find a series of websites and resources that all operate under this Creative Commons licensing. It's a teacher's best friend for sure. Now, as far as podcasts go, what else makes them great for our teaching contexts? Well, they're downloadable, which is great. So we don't need an internet connection after we download it, so we can just store it locally on a computer or a cell phone, because podcasts are also MP3 encoded, which is just a way of storing audio, and that makes it really small. So it doesn't take a lot of internet bandwidth to download and then have MP3s available. And like we were saying, they cover a range of topics. They can be educational, they can be entertaining, they can be scary stories or humorous stories. They can be interviews with people. And so what makes this nice is this allows them to be really light or small and flexible, so students can put them on their phones and listen to them on the bus or while they're walking to class. So there's a lot of different ways that students can access these and then listen to them without the need for a continuing internet connection or a fancy computer to play them. Almost any device will now play MP3s. So yeah, they can be downloaded onto smartphones, as Gladys is asking. They can be installed on MP3 players that students may have. Now, another reason to kind of think about podcasts and why podcasts is that they give students a chance to kind of explore a little bit of a genre, and they get to see that there's a pattern to these. So just like students would write an essay where they have a topic and they stay focused on that topic, podcasts are very similar, where you pick one topic and you discuss that one topic at length. And so it gives students a chance to do a little bit of writing. They can write a script, and then they can speak that. They can read it out loud, they can act it out, and it gives them a chance to kind of follow a structure and a pattern that can really help them understand how language is organized in English and how ideas are organized in English. And so part of this is an issue of being conversational, and it's a crucial part of a good podcast. It should be a dialogue between people. Students should not just give a speech, or they should not just record themselves talking, but they should have a clear message and a clear content. And you'll notice that many podcasts have their own rhythm, so students should listen to podcasts on the topic they want to cover so they can hear how they sound. And so if your students want to do interviews, we might want them to listen to interview podcasts on National Public Radio first. Or students interested in video games should listen to a game-focused podcast like Polygon's Quality Control. So just very quickly, let's do a raise your hand if you think your students would like to use podcasts in learning English. Oh, lots of hands go up all of a sudden. That's good to see. And as Nadia says, it'd be interesting to create one ourselves. That's what we're going to talk about next. Right? And so with podcasts, we want to think about that communicative aspect, getting our students to not just speak English, but communicate in English. And to think about that, we want to give them a structure. Now, typically when I have my students developing podcasts, they have to have a written description, explain what their podcast is going to be. They have to begin with an intro, which is a little summary. What are you going to talk about during your podcast? And of course, I love them to have theme music. I always enjoy when my students have their theme music that they put in there, which can act as a break between sections of the podcast. And then finally, I always encourage my students to focus on a specific topic. They should always be looking at what it is they're covering and staying on topic. It's a very important part of this. Now, the big question, though, is where are podcasts? So as Jaime says, if you have an Apple device, podcasts are easy to get. But if you don't have an Apple device, podcasts are still very easy to get. And so for those of you who are familiar with iTunes, it's a great place to start in terms of finding podcasts. Now, one of the issues with iTunes is that it is like a music store, but there's some great free material on iTunes. So we can always go there and find free to download, free to use podcasts. And so iTunes is kind of a music player and a distribution platform, and you can find it at apple.com.itunes or /iTunes, but you don't need to have iTunes. There's other great resources. And so one of the ways we can find podcasts is if you have iTunes and you download it, you can go to up in the top right corner of your iTunes store and click on that. And that takes us to the iTunes store where you can see music. And if you click on music, you'll see where it says podcasts. And once you get there, you can select podcasts. And then once you're in the podcast section of the iTunes store, you can look around and see lots of categories of podcasts. Now, iTunes, as Alfred in Bolivia asks, we have to pay? No, it's free to download. So you can just download it, surf around, but it does require an internet connection to find these podcasts. So when you download the podcast, you're going to need an internet connection. So once you've done that, you can go through here, look around, find a podcast that fit your interest, find a podcast that fit your student's interest, or maybe create your own and post one there. That'd be great. And so if you're looking for a specific category, you can always limit the category to education or language learning. There's tons of great material inside the podcast category. And so just a quick show of hands again. So raise your hand if you've ever asked one of your students for help with technology. See hands going up. You know, one of the things with iTunes is it may be a little intimidating at first, but ask your students for help. So they're always going to be more than happy to help you sort through the technology. So if it's not something you're comfortable with or you've never used it before, definitely ask your students for help. So they'll be more than happy. Can everybody still hear me out there? So the next kind of question is what if we don't want to use iTunes? Well, there are plenty of great options online. And so, for example, some are National Public Radio or Voice of America or the TED Talk podcast. And I've seen some of you mention TED Talk and National Public Radio. So another quick raise your hand if you're familiar with some of these websites. Has anyone ever used National Public Radio or Voice of America? Again, lots of hands going up. That's great to see. So let's look at some of these examples. So there's some great places we can go on these websites to find podcasts. And one of the best ones is National Public Radio. So they host podcasts on a wide range of educational topics. And the site breaks them out into topics for easier searching. So for example, if you go to their website, you can see arts, business, science and medicine, technology. Inside of these categories are podcasts that are interviews or podcasts that describe the latest news, or it could be something that focuses on a very specific story. Now, NPR tends to cover news and current events for the most part. So podcasts from this site, they're suitable for higher level learners, not necessarily for beginning learners. So that's another thing we want to consider when we start looking at podcasts are how appropriate are they in terms of language and language complexity for our students. Now, some of you mentioned in the chat, Voice of America is another popular destination for language teachers and language learners, and it's a great resource for us. However, we may not realize that it has a lot of great podcasts. And one of these that I really like is American Cafe, and it tells kind of little personal stories that give our students a chance to kind of hear more about American culture or American way of life that can be really interesting for them. And you can find things that are listed geographically, like Africa News Tonight, but then they also have Crossroads Asia that deals in topics that are relevant to Asia. So even if our students wanted to get some cross-cultural interaction, learn more about a particular part of the world, Voice of America News is a great place to go. Now, some other great websites are, for instance, Learn Out Loud. And the way Learn Out Loud works is it points you in the direction of podcasts. So it doesn't have its own podcast, but it tells you where to find great podcasts. Ismail asks, can we find different accents of English too? Yeah, Voice of America is a great one, and Learn Out Loud as well, to get a chance to have different accents, different dialects of English, and so students can get a wide range of exposure to different ways of speaking English. And so with Learn Out Loud, it breaks things out into categories like sports and hobbies, travel, politics, languages as well. So you can go in and find podcasts that are relevant to a particular area. And of course, some of you mentioned TED. TED is usually pretty famous for its videos. So TED Talks have some great videos, but they also have audio-only podcasts, which is nice because sometimes our internet connection's not so strong. So streaming video can be difficult, but we can download an audio podcast. Now, this is a great one to go to if your students are looking for, new ideas and current issues in regards to technology, entertainment, education, design, things like that. So TED Talks is another great one to go to. Another personal favorite is Public Radio Fan. And again, this is a collection of podcasts from all around the internet. And this one puts them into really nice categories. So for example, blues music podcasts. So if you're interested in hearing some very American style music, blues music would be great. Or business programs. If you're doing an English for specific purposes class, you can have your students listen to business podcasts. And again, that gives them a chance to listen to ideas they're familiar with, the business component, but then in English, they can make connections between the ideas and the English language vocabulary. And one last one that's a really great one is Podcast Alley. Now again, like Learn Out Loud, this one is a collection of podcasts from all around the web, but it shows kind of the biggest hits of podcasting each week and lists them on the site. And I recommend this one for getting the most popular podcasts at the moment. Now, podcasts have been around for almost a decade, but this year they saw a tremendous increase in popularity thanks to two instances. The first was National Public Radio had a podcast called Serial that over 10 million people listened to. So it was a really big kind of event. And then also there was a podcast, Mark Maron is the host, and he sat down with President Barack Obama for an hour and talked. And so that got a lot of attention in the news as well. And so podcasts have become, very popular this year. So as teachers, it's great to kind of capitalize on that popularity. Now, if you use podcasts in your classroom, so what do you recommend? So you've been, many of you have been putting ideas out there in the chat box, but do you have any recommendations specifically for the group? And then if you don't use podcasts, what other ways do you incorporate students' interests into your classroom? So I see Voice America up there. TED. Cultural issues are better than songs. Sports is good. Real deal English. Well, there's a lot of great ideas out there. So if we crowdsource these ideas, we get many more options to check out. And also be free to post your ideas. Definitely post your ideas over on the Ning. So after our webinar, we have our discussion over on the Ning. Bring some of these ideas with you so we can share as a big group, sort of crowdsource ways to find podcasts. Now, podcasts are great for bringing into the classroom, but what if we want to make our own materials? So that's always a great option, both from a teacher point of view, because as teachers, we know our students' level, our students' ability. We know what interests our students. We can bring that into the classroom by making our own podcasts. And even better, we can get students to make podcasts. So, I'm definitely going to link a few of my favorite podcasts to the Ning's resource page, so definitely check that out. But let's talk about making podcasts. All we really need to make a good podcast is a recording device like a mobile phone. Very simple. However, if we want to make great sounding podcasts like those we find online, we're going to need some audio recording and editing software. And for that, my recommendation is Audacity. And Audacity is free software, again, released under like a Creative Commons philosophy, and it's free to download, it's free to use, and it can be installed on PCs, Macs, and Linux computers. So very versatile. And now, if you've never used Audacity, it can look a little intimidating, but most things do, right? If we have a little bit of practice and some playtime, it'll be really easy, so don't panic. If this looks complicated, don't panic. Jump over to the Teacher's Corner this month over on the American English website, and you can find a tutorial on Audacity. But just a quick show of hands, or actually, let's do a poll. Have you ever used Audacity? It looks like a 3-4 split. About 75% of us have never used Audacity. About 25% of us have. Today's your lucky day. You're gonna learn about a great new piece of software that's sort of an essential in every teacher's toolkit. I highly recommend that Audacity become one of your tools for your classroom. So what is Audacity? Well, as I mentioned, it's recording software. So let's take a look. So this is the kind of Audacity screen, and these blue lines here in the middle, that's just my voice as I'm talking. I have my audio laid out right there. And so we can go in and record something. And so let's kind of take a look here. Now, this is a very simple recording. I just did a quick, simple recording, and that's not so important as much as the menu. Let's do a quick tutorial through the menu. Some great responses over in the chat box. Everyone's pretty fun. So the first thing we need to know about Audacity is recording functions. Now, just like a CD player that we might use in the classroom, Audacity has those same buttons. We can pause, we can play, stop, rewind, fast forward, and record. So we have those recording functions. And then we also have tools. So these tools allow us to change the audio file. So using these, we can select portions of the file. For example, the selector tool lets us highlight a portion of audio. And just like in Microsoft Word, we can highlight something, but then we can copy and paste it, and it works fantastically. And if you're familiar, as I mentioned, with Microsoft Word, you're halfway home in using Audacity. And also we have the menu system here, and this is similar to most other software that we would find. And this lets us save the file, edit the file, but also it has the generate and effect features, which are really nice. So we can raise pitch and lower pitch. We can add silence. We can manipulate the file a little bit, which lets us create really interesting audio files and makes it more kind of radio sounding. Now, if you're wondering where you can download this, again, we'll have the link over on the Ning page. So join us over on the Ning and you'll find the Audacity download link. Now, let's talk a little bit about the audio. For most of the screen, we have the recording that we're using. And so here you can just see like a quick little example of me saying, test, test. But I can record one line of audio. I can record a second line of audio. So for example, I can put music in, copy and paste music straight into the software. And so now, just like those podcasts we hear online, we can add our voice, we can add other people's voices. So we can do interviews that we add in or take out. We can edit things. This is a really nice feature. And so it lets us create more professional sounding podcasts. Now, maybe I'm not using Audacity to create my own podcast. Maybe I'm just going to use it to edit other podcasts. So maybe there's a podcast that's an hour, pretty long. I only need maybe 5 minutes of it for a listening activity in my class. Well, what you can do with Audacity is you can open up an audio file. You can highlight a section. So I really only want my students to hear this one piece. So I can take that, and just like I would in Word or another system, I can hit kind of Control X. I can copy, and then I can I can delete that. So I can copy it. I can cut it out of the file. I can create a new Audacity file, paste that in there, and now I have only that little section that I want my students to listen to. So if I'm going to do a listening activity, there I go. So now I've got that one little small component. Another nice feature about this cutting and pasting and editing is I can have my students do audio journals. And if they have pronunciation that's a little off, or their intonation or stress needs a little bit of work, I can edit their audio journal and insert my feedback directly into their journal. So students can speak, and when they mispronounce, oh, bam, the teacher's voice comes in and says, hey, you may want to check this pronunciation. Listen to the way I say it. You give the correct pronunciation, and the students get that extra feedback. That's really nice. Now, we went through that really, really fast. Is anyone confused? Show of hands. That's good. A few people. Okay, so don't panic. Like all technology, takes a little bit of practice. And so if you're having, if you want to try Audacity but you're not sure where to begin, go over to that Teacher's Corner this week. You can see the link in the chat box. Go ahead and take a look at that, and that'll give you a chance to catch up on all that. We give you step-by-step instructions on how to create a podcast. So definitely don't panic. And of course, over on the Ning, we'll have a discussion after this, so you can come in and we'll talk a little bit more about Audacity and what to use Audacity for. So don't worry too much if you didn't catch all that. But in the chat box, I'd like to hear from everyone out there. And so my question is, what other classroom activities could be created with Audacity? And then, do you have other recording tools or software that you recommend? Ooh, role plays. I like Helen's idea of having role plays. Students could act out a little dialogue. Conversations, so we can record dialogues. Radio show. I love the idea of a radio show. We're actually going to talk about that later in the webinar. I've never thought of karaoke, but I don't think anyone wants to hear me sing. So these are some really great ideas, and so if you want to share these over at the Ning, please do so as well. This will be a great conversation for all of us to have as teachers. Oh, we got short presentations or some other ideas. That's from Pat. Jonathan says rap songs. Yes, we do all sorts of music, right? Lots of different musical styles. And it's also fun to have students trade their files. So if they sing a song or if they write and read some poetry, they can definitely share those around and students can listen. Now, if we're going to actually ask students to do these sorts of things, we need to think about like what makes a podcast great. Or even if we're talking audio journals or if we're talking dialogues, what makes them great? So that's the big issue for our students, because often we want to get them to really work on their speaking, their pronunciation, but there's definitely more to it. And the whole idea here is we want them to say it well. So the real goal with a podcast is not just to speak, but communicate. And part of that really comes down to our students' stress and intonation. With this, we want to think about words per minute. And so that's, between 150 to 160 is, conversational in English. It's not too fast, it's not too slow, and it gives a nice rhythm to the language. Now, if I took away, if I slowed down my words for a minute and I took away my stress and intonation, what if I gave the webinar like this, and the entire time this is how I talked? I don't think you would listen for very long. You probably all fall asleep, right? And so we want to make sure that they're speaking, right? They're stressing and intonating. A lot of times in entertainment and engagement, we talk about entertainment where you're leaning back versus leaning forward. So if something is kind of slow, it's relaxing, I tend to lean back while I'm listening. But when I'm engaged, when I'm interested, I lean forward, right? So we want students to create podcasts. We want them to create information that's communicative, not just speaking. So how do we do that? Well, we want to give them a chance, like I said, to work on that communication style. And a great place to start that is by giving our students a bit of autonomy in the topics and ideas that they choose when podcasting. So if we outline the characteristics of autonomy and take a look, Dickinson in 1987 kind of outlined some ideas for autonomy, but I really want to focus in on just this idea of setting learning objectives and prioritizing them, because this is really kind of the important part. Now, as teachers, we could do this one of two ways. First, we could give them a list of topics, and students choose which of those. But it would be great to even just throw open all the ideas and tell students, you choose the topic. So let them kind of delve into a topic that really interests them. And the way I like to structure this with my students is, I tell them that they need to plan their podcast. And part of this is they have to begin with their sort of objective statement. So before my students create their podcast, they write, by the end of my podcast, the listener will ... So for example, some ideas that my students have done is, by the end of the podcast, my listener will be up to date on Premier League events. They will know the essential listening for K-pop or Korean pop music, or they'll have an understanding of the popularity of League of Legends. And so this League of Legends idea here is great. It's a video game if you're unfamiliar with it. And so I really make sure my students understand that they're not telling me the rules of this video game. They're not telling me why they like it. But the podcast should be about helping me understand the popularity of the game. So, students just shouldn't talk about movies. Talk about their favorite movie and why that movie is interesting. And so let's take a look at an example. This is a podcast that one of my students made. And so let's give it a listen, and you can see what a student-made podcast sounds like.
Good evening and welcome to Movie Mania. I am your host Tanya, and today we are discussing The Notebook, a story of never-ending love that makes me cry every time I watch it. There is so much to love about this movie, so let's start with the actors.
Now, I have to say my student was terrified when I asked her if I could use her podcast for this. But she tries to meet that genre, right? She tries to be just like the podcast she's listened to, and her whole goal is to explain why this is a great movie. So she's going to talk. She talks about the actors in the movie, and then she'll talk a little bit about the story and why the story is important. And so what we really need to do is get our students to kind of focus in on those topics. And so having them plan is really, really important. And part of this comes down to it's not only speaking, right? But we want to get them engaged in a variety of skill sets. And part of this is an idea of these 21st century skills. And so, if you think about these, and if you attended the webinar, the first webinar of the series by Eve Smith, her social media as tools for community engagement, you'll know that this idea of 21st century skills is really important because students they're not just working on English anymore, but English is a gateway to a larger culture online. And so how do we get them to engage with these materials? So part of this comes down to getting them to think about creativity and innovation, communication and collaboration, research and information. Of course, digital literacy too, that's really important. So for example, when my students do podcasts, they have to research information. So they have to prepare well in advance. They have to go find the necessary information. They have to figure out how to write the script. There should be a script that they follow. Of course, they need to learn how to use Audacity, so they're going to learn to record and edit. And then once that's done, they have to think about conversations. They're going to listen to their podcast and see how it sounds. Does it need to kind of fix things? Do they need to improve the intonation or the pronunciation to better engage their listeners? And so in the chat box, just have a couple of questions for you. What other objectives could you brainstorm if we think about topics students could discuss? And what topics would your students be interested in? For my class, my students love to discuss movies from their home countries, and they love to discuss current events. Food, environment, sports. And so it'd be great. I love that idea of culinary or food. Students could talk about a food from their home country, how to make it, the history of the food, why it's famous in their country, what does it mean in terms of culture. They could do a TV series. I like that idea of each week they could review portions of a TV show, right? Keep you up to date on a variety of shows. Social media. I'd love to see a podcast on what's happening in social media. And also we could think about, Sameh has a great idea, global warming. Students could tackle more serious issues as a way to better understand these issues. How is it affecting home? How is it affecting the world? Sandra says the history of their favorite soccer team. That would be great. A podcast that shows you when the team started, the most important players over time. So there's all these great ideas that we can access. But again, these require our students kind of dig into the research, find information, write it all up, and present it effectively. So they're not just practicing their English, they're practicing communication skills. And as I said before, this kind of comes down to this idea of, genre, understanding that there's a format to podcasts, there's a format to communication. And the better you follow that format, the easier it'll be for your audience to kind of understand and follow and really kind of dig into your ideas. And as I mentioned, podcasts have these set ways of delivering themselves. So we have written descriptions, an intro, music. They focus on a very specific topic. So making sure your students understand this when they dig into it is really great. I would love to see a podcast where my students explain video games, because a lot of teachers I work with don't understand why they're so fascinating. That we need to get a student's perspective on what makes them fascinating. Right? But by and large, what this really kind of comes down to is we want our students to be entertaining. And podcasts can be a great way to do that, because if they give a speech in class, you make a mistake, it can be kind of hard to bounce back. Students get worried about making mistakes, but with a podcast, if you don't like the way it sounds, you can delete it, start it again, right? So they get this chance to kind of practice, and when they fail, they can make corrections, and it's less threatening than getting up and speaking in front of the class. So it gives them a chance to practice without worrying about failure. They can try this again and again and again until they get it right. So that gives them a chance to really think about making something worth listening to. And this relates back to autonomy as learners, because when they pick a podcast that they are interested in, they know more about that topic and they have more information to share. So if they're doing a review of movies or a weekly roundup of football, that's something they're passionate about. That's something they want to communicate. Outside of the English component, what is it they want to communicate? And so, of course, we really want to think about this and push our students in that direction, because it's really important to give them those opportunities. But maybe we want to step back and do something as a group. So instead of doing individual podcasts, we can make a radio play. So there's a lot of great examples online of material. So for example, if you go to archive.org, this is the Internet Archive website, they have these old-fashioned radio plays from the 1930s and 1940s, yeah, like Sherlock Holmes, where they can listen and again, get a sense of that genre, how these radio plays work. And then a website like genericradio.com has scripts. So you could download the script as a class, pass it out, sign roles, turn Audacity on, and you could record a class play. So students could get a chance to do these plays and do a web radio show every week. I love the idea. And then those radio plays become listening material for classroom activities. Now, as teachers, of course, the big issue is, how do we grade this? I would love it if my students could just make podcasts, but I do need something to grade. And so I have this rubric, and this rubric is going to be up on the NING website. And you can see I've got it separated kind of into two parts here, because I need to grade my students' English, but then I also want to grade their communicative abilities. And I do that in terms of what I like to call their communicative competence. And so I begin my rubric by having overall spoken English intelligibility. How well did they speak? Their intonation and variation. Is their stress and phrasal patterns great? But I also grade them on what I call the audience interaction and awareness, or the organization of content of the podcast. How well is it organized? How much do they make an effort to interact with the audience or the interviewee? And so part of this all kind of goes into their grade, and it gives them a chance to see what they did well in their podcast, what they didn't do as well as in their podcast. And so the next time they can fix that. So my students will take the rubric, look at it, and their next podcasts are going to try to address those concerns. So that gives them a chance to practice, change things up a little bit. And for students trying new things, that's really, really important, is when they fail, to give them a chance to take feedback and make improvements. Because as they take their failures and turn them into successes, they're going to be able to kind of turn this around. Now, some of you have mentioned, well, what about places where internet connection is limited? That's the nice part, is with podcasts, you can download these things. You can go to a computer, if you happen to be in the city, you could download 15 or 20 podcasts when you're around a good internet connection. And then when you go back to your school, you have like a little library of podcasts that you can draw from. And so you don't need the internet connection except for when you're downloading them. And like Maria asks, she says, how long can Audacity recording be? It can be as long as you want. As long as you have the computer space, it could be a several hour long recording. So don't worry too much about recording space. And so the most important part of this, though, is slow and steady wins. We don't have to do all this at once. Instead, we want to think about using it in small chunks. So maybe just bring a podcast to class, have students listen as homework, have students record something on their cell phones. Then as a teacher, try Audacity. Then try making your own podcast with it fitting the genre, just as we said. And then have students make podcasts. So this doesn't have to be done in a week. It could be done over a semester or a year. The most important part is you go at the speed you're comfortable at. If you do that, it'll make things much, much easier, and you don't have to worry about the technical component. And also, remember to access the great resources you have in the other teachers. So come over to the Ning and join our discussions, share your ideas, learn from other teachers, and that'll definitely help you win the race. And so just a quick little reference there, and want to say thanks and see if anyone has questions. Yeah, definitely try Audacity, give it a shot. Like I said, we're here for questions, but if you're logging off, definitely thank you for coming, and I look forward to talking to all of you over on the Ning. So definitely make sure to join that and check out the Teacher's Corner for more help on using Audacity in the classroom. Do students have to have a smartphone? No, they don't. Even if your students have those little MP3 players, and you can find those in most markets around the world. That's all they need. MP3 files are really versatile. They can fit a lot of things. So whether it's a CD player, a computer, MP3 player, you can definitely play an MP3. Good question. How many sessions do I need to prepare my students for podcasts? Typically, we do one in class together. So I give one class period over to kind of making a podcast and learning the tools. And then each week they record one. So typically one class period to practicing it. And then the next class period, they can bring in questions if they had trouble doing their podcasting homework. So I'd say about 2 sessions. And after that, they've pretty much learned. Good question. How would I get it from my phone or my computer to their MP3 player? Well, that'll be the tricky part. Now, you could email it to students, or students could bring in USBs and copy it. So getting it moved over to your students, MP3 player or phone, but your students will know how. That's the best part as a teacher, is your students will definitely know how to transfer that information, and so kind of help them and let them take the lead on sharing it, because they'll know how. Danielle asks, how large can a class be to use this podcast? It could be of any size. Now, if you have all the students doing a recording, it could be difficult with a large class, but if they're recording individually or in small groups, which is even better, I find typically more than 3 or 4 people working together on an Audacity file, and it tends to get confusing. Jonathan asks, is there a way to connect this with reading or writing skills? Certainly, because you could take the podcast, students could listen to it, they could write a summary, or you could write down, for instance, like a transcript. So students could listen and write what they hear, or they could, or you could give them kind of a brief transcription and do like a close activity where they're listening to the podcast and filling in information. So there's ways to combine it with writing and reading. That's really great. Yeah, as Jules says, listen to the podcast and read the transcript at the same time is a great way to do that. All right, everyone. Thanks for coming to the webinar. Look forward to it. Definitely be sure to come to the next webinar. And so I'll see you there, and thanks for joining today.